Welcome to Whiskey 101 and 102. Within this class, we will discuss the differences between the varieties of whiskey. The name whiskey is a Gaelic word meaning water. The name itself is spelled in two different ways. Traditionally, whiskey is associated with most whiskies worldwide. Most commonly, you find the spelling of whiskey like this associated with Canada, Japan, Scotland, England, Wales and even Australia. You will also find whiskey spelled like this. Whiskey with an E is traditionally associated with Irish and American whiskies. So, why are there two different spellings? Some people argue that whiskey is only spelled differently because of the differences in language, while others argue that the difference in spelling is really based on the styles and methods of producing whiskey. Today, you will find many American whiskies with the spelling without an E. Whiskey is a heavily restricted product worldwide because it has many different types and classes. So, what exactly is whiskey? Whiskey is distilled beverage from a fermented mash of a variety of grains, which include corn, wheat, barley, rye, malted barley and malted rye. Whiskies can be aged or unaged, but traditionally, whiskies are aged in white charred oak. We will start with American whiskey. American whiskey are distilled from a fermented mash of cereal grain. It must have the taste, aroma, and other characteristics commonly attributed to whiskey. Bourbon whiskey has three main requirements. It must be distilled from at least 51% corn mash, aged in new charred oak barrels and produced in the United States. Bourbon has no minimum specified duration for its aging period. Products aged for as little as 3 months are sold as bourbon. Bourbon that meets the requirements, has been aged for a minimum of 2 years, and does not have added coloring, flavoring, or other spirits may be labeled as straight bourbon. American rye whiskey must be produced from at least 51% rye, and aged in new charred oak barrels. Rye whiskey that has been so aged for at least 2 years may be further designated as straight, as in straight rye whiskey. The major differences between rye and bourbon are pretty significant. Considering that the only real difference is the mash that it is produced from, rye whiskeys tend to be lighter and produces spicier and fruitier aromas and tastes, while bourbons tend to be more full-bodied and rather sweeter. Tennessee whiskey is technically bourbon whiskey, made in Tennessee. There are many whiskeys, made in Tennessee, that cannot be labeled as Tennessee whiskey, because they are not produced in the same method as a bourbon. For example, unaged whiskey, sometimes referred to as moonshine, produced in Tennessee, cannot be labeled as Tennessee whiskey. Irish whiskey must be distilled and aged in the island of Ireland, and it must be aged for at least 3 years in wooden casks. There are 4 types of Irish whiskey: blends, single pot still, single malts, and single grains. Blended whiskey is a product made by mixing column still product with richer and more intense pot still product. Those made entirely from malted barley distilled in a pot still are referred to as single malt whiskies. Single pot still whiskey, made from a mixture of malted and unmalted barley, completely distilled in a pot still. A whiskey is continuously distilled from unmalted grains. It is referred to as grain whiskey. Scotch whiskey is malt whiskey or grain whiskey made in Scotland. There are 5 major Scotch whiskies: single malt Scotch whiskey, single grain Scotch whiskey, blended malt Scotch whiskey, blended grain Scotch whiskey, and blended Scotch whiskey. All Scotch whiskey must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years. Any age statement on a bottle of Scotch whiskey, expressed in numerical form, must reflect the age of the youngest whiskey used to produce that product. A whiskey with an age statement is known as guaranteed age whiskey. The majority of grain whiskey produced in Scotland goes to make blended Scotch whiskey. The average blended whiskey is 60%-85% grain whiskey. Some higher quality grain whiskey from a single distillery is bottled as single grain whiskey. Blended malt whiskey, formerly called vatted malt or pure malt, is one of the least common types of Scotch, a blend of single malts from more than one distillery. Blended malts contain only malt whiskies, no grain whiskies, and are usually distinguished from other types of whiskey by the absence of the word single before malt on the bottle. Blended Scotch whiskies contain both malt whiskey and grain whiskey. Single malt Scotch whisky means a Scotch whisky produced from only water and malted barley at a single distillery by batch distillation in pot stills. Single grain Scotch whisky means a Scotch whisky distilled at a single distillery but water and malted barley may involve whole grains of other malted or unmalted cereals. Most Canadian whiskies are blended multi-grain liquors containing a large percentage of corn spirits, and are typically lighter and smoother than other whiskey styles. A Canadian whiskey must be mashed, distilled and aged in Canada. All spirits used in making a Canadian whiskey must be aged for at least 3 years in wooden barrels. It is a pretty common misconception that Canadian whiskies are made from rye. For centuries, Canadian whiskey was referred as rye, and is still commonly called rye. The primary grain used in Canadian whiskey is corn, not rye. Canada does use many grains in its cereal to produce its whiskies. However, if a Canadian whiskey claims rye on the label, it does not demand for rye to be within the product. There are many more regions that produce whiskey. For example, Japan, India, Australia, and many more. However, in this course we will only focus on the regions we discussed. Next, let's discuss the verbiage of whiskey. The word body refers to the related mouth feel, indicating product character, used with qualifying terms. Full-bodied, lacking body, etc. Complex refers to seeming to possess many layers of flavor, for which time is needed to examine and characterize all of them. Creamy refers to a whiskey possessing the mouthfeel of, for example, half and half. The term dry refers to as astringent and not sweet. In extreme cases the spirit can feel as if it contains no moisture. Finish means the time period in malt tasting after one has swallowed the spirit. Firm refers to mouthfeel. Contrast with soft. Malt, or malty refers to the aroma and flavor of malted barley. Malt can also be an abbreviation of single malt Scotch whisky. Mouth coating refers to the feeling of giving the impression that your mouth has coated the inside of your mouth, as with a syrup. Peat, or peaty is a significant flavor element in many malts. This heavy, smoky, somewhat vegetative flavor is imparted by the distillery water having run over peat. Rich means possessing robust, highly flavored elements, usually with a thick mouthfeel. Soft refers to mouthfeel, like a marshmallow. Contrast with firm. How does one go about serving whiskey? Whiskey can be served in a mixed cocktail, or on the rocks in a rocks glass, but when whiskey is served neat, it should be served at room temperature. The purists will tell you that it should be served in a large rocks glass, to get all the aromas. Purists will also want a bottle of water. When serving a whiskey neat, the guest may want to drop a drop or two of water into the whiskey. By doing this, the whiskey expels more aromas and flavors. Finally, we will discuss pairing whiskeys with cuisine. When pairing whiskey with food, the characteristics of the meal it will complement need to be taken into consideration. Whiskey drinkers and food enthusiasts need to approach the whiskey food experience with a strong sense of realism. Whiskeys have such a wide range of flavors and tastes. Some may be light whiskeys that could easily be paired with a fish, while others are too bold to be paired with a meal. The most important thing to remember is to complement and enhance a meal. A good example of this includes a smoky, peaty or peppery whiskey goes well with oysters and smoked fish. This course was Whiskey 101 and 102. Thank you for taking the course.